"Don't touch that envelope, Mr. Aldridge." The voice was small, barely audible above the string quartet playing near the window, but in that half-second pause between one song and the next it carried. Every head in the room turned. 63 people had gathered in the private dining room of the Aldridge Group's headquarters on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Toronto. The view through the floor-to-ceiling windows was the kind that reminded you why people wanted to reach the top. Lake Ontario flat and silver in the October dusk. The city lights just beginning to flicker on below. The table was set with white linen, crystal, and the kind of quiet that comes from money that doesn't need to announce itself. It was supposed to be a retirement dinner, 52 years. That was how long Harrison Aldridge had practiced law. He had started as a junior clerk in a firm that no longer existed, working out of an office so small he'd had to angle his chair to open the door. He had built something from nothing, not by inheritance, not by luck, but by reading every contract twice and never signing anything he didn't fully understand. His firm had grown into one of the most respected corporate law practices in the country. His name was on the letterhead, his name was on the building, and tonight the people who had worked alongside him for decades, partners, associates, paralegals, clerks who had become executives in their own right, had come to send him off. The dinner had gone beautifully, the speeches were warm and honest. Several people had cried. Harrison himself had laughed more than he had in years, and when his daughter Sylvia had stood and said that her father was the most stubborn, most principled, most infuriating man she had ever known, and that she was grateful every single day that he was hers, the room had given her a standing ovation. Now dessert had been cleared. The champagne had been refilled. Someone had wheeled out a trolley of gifts, cards and boxes wrapped in silver paper, a few bottles of whiskey from people who knew him well enough to know what he actually liked. And at the far end of the trolley, apart from the others, sat a cream-colored envelope, thick stock. His name written across the front in a hand he didn't immediately recognize. He had reached for it almost as an afterthought. That was when the girl spoke. She was 9 years old. Her name was Adeze. Everyone called her Ada. And she was the granddaughter of Josephine Obi, who had been Harrison's personal assistant for 27 years, and who was seated 2 chairs down from him, already half rising from her seat with a look on her face that was equal parts alarm and mortification. "Ada," Josephine said very quietly, "sit down." But the girl was already standing, her chair pushed back, her dark eyes fixed on that envelope with an intensity that seemed almost too large for her small face. "I don't think you should open that one, Mr. Aldridge," she said again, more clearly now, as if she had decided the first time had been practice. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the far end of the table. Someone, Harrison thought it was Paul Lester, one of his senior partners, made a sound that wasn't quite a chuckle and wasn't quite polite. "Sweet Pia," said Josephine, and her voice had gone low and careful. "This isn't the moment." "I know," Ada said, "but he shouldn't open it." Harrison looked at the girl. He had known her since she was an infant, had watched her toddle around Josephine's office on the rare occasions family emergencies had required it, had given her a candy from his desk drawer more times than he could count. She was a serious child. He had always thought that about her. Serious in the way some children are, where you can see something behind their eyes that is paying closer attention than anyone gives them credit for. "And why is that?" he asked, not dismissively. Genuinely curious. Ada pressed her lips together. She glanced at something, someone, down the table, and then back at him. "Because of where it came from." She said, "I saw who put it there." The laughter had stopped now. Josephine had her hand on the girl's arm. "Ada, that is enough. Mr. Aldridge has a room full of guests, and—" "Who put it there?" Harrison said. The room had gone very quiet. The string quartet had stopped. They had been given the signal to wrap up 10 minutes ago and had apparently chosen this exact moment to comply. Ada lifted her chin. "Mr. Graham," she said, "but not at the gift table. He came in through the side door, and he put it there by itself, and then he went back out. And then later he came in through the main door like he had just arrived." A chair scraped back at the middle of the table. Harrison didn't look right away. He kept his eyes on Ada for a moment longer, because something in the steadiness of her gaze made him want to be sure he understood what he was seeing before he turned. He turned. Clifton Graham was 55 years old and had been a partner at the Aldridge Group for 18 years. He was a tall man with gray at his temples, and the particular kind of ease in a room that comes from never having had to worry about being unwelcome in one. He was holding his champagne flute in both hands now, and the knuckles, Harrison noticed, were white. "I came in early to make sure the room was set up properly," Clifton said. His voice was perfectly controlled. "I was doing you a favor, Harrison. I was here for an hour before anyone else arrived." "Through the side door," Ada said. Clifton looked at the girl with an expression that was not quite contempt but was adjacent to it. Children sometimes misremember things, he said to the room as much as to her. I didn't misremember, Ada said. She was not loud. She was not dramatic. She stood very straight and spoke very clearly, and Harrison thought that in 30 years she was going to be terrifying in a courtroom. I was with my gran in the hallway because I needed water. And the kitchen was that way. I saw you come in through the side door. You were wearing your coat. You had the envelope. You put it at the end of the trolley and you went back out. Josephine had stopped trying to sit her down. Harrison, said Sylvia from across the table, and her voice had that quality it got when she was working very hard to stay calm. Maybe we should just set the envelope aside for now. Harrison looked at the envelope in his hand. He had not opened it. He had not consciously decided not to. He had simply been held in place by the conversation. He set it down on the table. Clifton, he said. What's in the envelope? I have no idea what the child thinks she saw. Clifton's jaw was tight. I brought you a card, Harrison. It's from me and Sandra. It should be in the pile with the others. Is there a card from you in the pile? Harrison asked without looking away from Clifton. A pause. Then Renata Muir, his second-in-command for 11 years, reached across the gift trolley and sorted through the envelopes in the main stack. Her hands moved methodically. When she stopped, the expression on her face was carefully neutral. There's no card from Clifton or Sandra in here, she said. The silence in the room became a different kind of silence. Clifton said nothing. Harrison picked up the cream envelope again and looked at it. The handwriting was not Clifton's. He had seen Clifton's handwriting on enough documents over the years to know. Someone else had written his name. Someone who pressed hard with the pen. I'd like you to open it, Harrison said. He was looking at Clifton. If it's simply a card you brought for me, then open it and show us. Harrison, you're making a scene over a child's imagination. Open the envelope, Clifton. It was not loud. Harrison Aldridge had spent 52 years never needing to raise his voice to make himself heard. He had learned early that quiet certainty carried further than volume. He said it once, evenly, and the room heard the way. Rooms hear something that is not a request. Clifton did not move, and in that stillness, that particular, loaded stillness that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, but felt considerably longer. Harrison understood. He had built a career on reading what people did not say. He had sat across from executives and opposing counsel and people who were certain they had outmaneuvered him, and he had learned to watch for the moment when someone stopped performing and simply revealed. Clifton Graham had been in this firm for 18 years. Harrison had trusted him with files that would have ruined careers if they had leaked. He had backed him for partnership over 2 other candidates who, in retrospect, had perhaps been the better choice. He looked at the envelope in his hand. He looked at Ada, who was still standing very straight and watching him with those serious dark eyes. Then he looked back at Clifton and said, calmly and clearly, I think we need to call someone. Renata was already reaching for her phone. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not dramatic in the way things are dramatic in films. There was no shouting, no one threw anything. The guests sat, most of them in a peculiar suspended state, too stunned to leave, too uncertain to speak. The catering staff retreated to the edges. The string quartet, with admirable professionalism, quietly packed their instruments. A security officer from the building's private firm arrived first. Then, because Renata had made a second call, 2 officers from the Toronto Police Service's Financial Crimes Unit. It turned out she had a contact there, which surprised no one who had worked with her for any length of time. The envelope was handled with gloves. Inside it was a document, 12 pages, dense with figures, bearing Harrison's name and, on the signature line at the bottom of the last page, a signature that looked very much like his. It was not his signature. Harrison had signed enough of his own name in 52 years to know it the way you know your own reflection. The loops were too loose, the H too upright. Someone had studied it and come close, but close was not sufficient when the document in question purported to authorize the transfer of $11.4 million from a dormant client trust account. An account Harrison had not touched in 3 years, into a numbered company registered in Alberta. The document was dated that evening. The implication was not subtle. A signed authorization timestamped the night of his retirement dinner, when champagne was flowing and attention was elsewhere. He would have opened the envelope, perhaps read it in private later, perhaps assumed it was something administrative that had been misrouted to the gift table, or perhaps he would have never connected it to what followed, because what followed would have been quiet. A transfer, a paper trail, a document with his name at the bottom. By the time anyone noticed the discrepancy, Harrison Aldridge would have been a retired man with no daily access to the firm's records. He sat very still while the officers explained what they were looking at. He had the odd sensation of hearing his own life described as a case file. He answered their questions concisely and without elaboration, because that was how he had been taught to speak to investigators, and it was a habit, too deep to drop, even now. Clifton had asked for a lawyer within the first 10 minutes. Harrison had found something unbearably sad about that. Not the request itself, which was reasonable, but the reflex of it. 18 years, and it had come to this room this evening, this envelope. He did not know yet the full shape of what Clifton had done. That would take months to unravel. The forensic accountants, the document analysts, the interviews. But from what the officers indicated that night, it appeared that Clifton had been systematically moving small amounts through client accounts for at least 4 years, keeping each transaction below the threshold that would trigger automatic review. The total, when it was finally calculated, would be substantial. The plan, and there had clearly been a plan, had required one final document to consolidate and redirect the funds before the firm's ownership structure changed hands in the new year. Harrison's forged signature was that document. After Clifton was escorted from the room, after the statements had been given, and the officers had taken everything they needed, after the guests had slowly, quietly dispersed into the elevator lobby with the careful, shell-shocked courtesy of people who had witnessed something they would be processing for a long time, Harrison sat alone at the end of the long table. The city was fully dark now, the lights of Toronto spread out below him in every direction, cold and brilliant. Josephine came and sat beside him. She did not say anything for a while, which was why he had trusted her for 27 years. She saw something and she spoke up, Harrison said finally. Even when everyone looked at her like she was interrupting. She's always been like that, Josephine said. Since she was very small, she notices things and she says them. I used to worry it would get her into trouble. It got Clifton into trouble. He paused, which is where Clifton deserved to be. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a plane banked over the lake, its lights blinking red and white. Is she all right? He asked. Embarrassed, I think. She didn't like all the attention. She handled it better than most adults in this room. Josephine smiled very slightly. Don't tell her that. Her head is already an appropriate size for her body, and I'd like to keep it that way. Harrison laughed. It surprised him. The ease of it, the way it came from somewhere genuine. He had not expected to be able to do that tonight. He looked at his hands on the table, 52 years of reading documents. 52 years of trusting his judgment of people, of reading the spaces between what was said and what was meant. He had been good at it. He had built something because of it. And tonight, a 9-year-old girl with a cup of water had seen what he had missed. He thought about that for a long time. The financial investigation took 8 months. Harrison followed it from his home in Rosedale, where he had finally genuinely retired, reading the updates that Renata sent him, and the occasional call from the officers assigned to the case. The total amount Clifton had redirected was slightly over $3 million, not the $11 million the final document would have moved. Most of it was recoverable. The numbered company in Alberta was dissolved. 3 other individuals with connections to Clifton's personal accounts were also named in the investigation. Clifton was charged in the spring. Harrison did not attend the hearing. He did not feel that he needed to. What he did do, in November, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, was meet Josephine and Ada for lunch at a small restaurant near his daughter Sylvia's house in the annex. It was Sylvia who had suggested the place. She had been the one to track down Josephine's phone number, actually, and had called her herself. Ada arrived wearing a yellow wool coat and carrying a library book about migratory birds, which she set on the table beside her and consulted briefly while they were waiting for their food. She did not seem particularly interested in being the center of the occasion. Harrison waited until the soup arrived. Then he said, I want to thank you properly for what you did. Ada considered this with the same seriousness she brought to most things. I just said what I saw, she said. I know. That's the part that matters. She looked at him. You believed me, she said. After a while, I should have believed you sooner. She seemed to think this was fair, but not something worth dwelling on. She picked up her spoon. My gran said you're a lawyer, she said. I was. I've retired now. Did you like it? He thought about it honestly, the way he hadn't been asked to in years. Most of the time, he said. The reading, the thinking, the trying to understand what people actually meant, not just what they said. I liked that part. Ada nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they recognize something. I like that part too, she said. When you watch people and you can tell what they're actually doing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Josephine, who was watching her granddaughter with an expression that required no translation. I've spoken to a few people, Harrison said, reaching into his jacket pocket and placing an envelope on the table, a plain white one, nothing like the cream-colored envelope that had started all of this. There's a science and law program at the University of Toronto. They run a summer camp for young students who are interested in both. I've made a donation in your name and arranged a spot for you when you're ready if you'd like it. Ada looked at the envelope. She did not grab it. She looked at her grandmother, who nodded once, and then she looked back at Harrison. That's a long time from now, she said. It is, he agreed, but some things are worth planning for. She reached across the table and picked up the envelope carefully, with both hands, and held it in her lap. Outside the window, the leaves were still on the maples, gold and red and the particular amber that only happens in October in Ontario, when the light is low and the air smells of lake water and the city feels briefly like it might be kind. Thank you, Mr. Aldridge, Ada said. She opened her library book to the page she had left off and set it beside her bowl, glancing at it between spoonfuls with the easy contentment of someone who had never needed a room to be paying attention to her. Harrison watched her and felt something settle in his chest, something that had been slightly misaligned, he realized, for longer than just tonight. He picked up his own spoon. Sylvia was talking to Josephine about something. A garden, a neighbor, something warm and ordinary, and the restaurant was full of the comfortable noise of people eating and not pretending to be anywhere other than exactly where they were. He thought about 52 years, about the documents and the files and the long rows of names on letterhead. He thought about an envelope he hadn't opened. He thought about a 9-year-old girl who had simply said what she saw, even when every adult in the room had looked at her as though she were interrupting something important. She had been right. They had all been interrupted. He was grateful for it.